So the lower house of the legislature is known as the Duma, as I mentioned, since the 1905 revolution. Um, it's composed of 450 seats. Each one's a 5-year term. What you can do if you're in the Duma is you can start legislation, you can reject legislation. You can also override a presidential veto if you have two-thirds of the vote to do so. Another key power of the members of parliament in the Duma is to approve the prime minister and this vote of no confidence, which I've already talked about a lot. This hasn't been done yet, by the way. Under Yeltsin, most legislation started in the Duma. But under Putin, most legislation has been top down, and that carried through with Medvedev also because that was really more or less under Putin. So that's important to keep in mind. The upper house is called the Federation Council. It's composed of 178 seats. It used to be composed of the governor and the Duma head of each region, but then too much local power was at the national level. And it still represents the local interest. They have 2 representatives from each of the 89 federal administrative units, but they're chosen indirectly. One is chosen by the regional legislature, and then the other one is chosen by the governor, who since 2004 was appointed by the president, but I mentioned a few minutes ago, is now subject to elections. So far, it's been the president's party, though. What the Federation Council does is the Federation Council rejects international treaties, has to approve presidential appointments to the Constitutional Court, has to approve declarations of war, martial law, and does have to approve all the bills that deal with the budget, although the Duma can override them with a 2/3 vote. The electoral system, since 2007, has been a PR-only system with a 7% threshold. And so obviously here we're talking about the Duma. If you don't make that, then your party's votes are proportionally divvied up among those who did. So a bigger share of the seats goes to a party than the actual popular vote would suggest, because it got the rest from other parties that didn't make the threshold. Previously, they tried a couple different ways. From 1990 to 1993, they had an SMD system. In 1993, the Constitution gave half of the Duma a plurality system, and then half was a MMD PR system with a 5% threshold. You don't really need to know this, but the point is that the result then was that you had 2 larger parties plus some smaller ones who really became necessary to forming ruling coalitions. Now with the strict PR vote, it really depends. Although Putin's party has dominated, as you'll see in a second. The party system's generally fragmented. You've got a lot of turnover. Parties in Russia are weakly institutionalized. In other words, they're less about platforms and more about current issues and personalities. Often it's about catapulting one person to the presidency, as it was with respect to Putin and Medvedev. The first party up here is the Communist Party. Hasn't been particularly happy with the post-1991 direction of the state. They draw most of their support from older people. This is the most institutionalized party in that it inherited the infrastructure as well as a long-preached ideology, as well as members from the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union went away, the Communist Party was the only one that was a strong party. It's much more social democratic now, and as of 2011, they had about 20% of the seats in parliament, which is a pretty good showing. The second party here, a Just Russia party, is an umbrella party that includes what's known as the Motherland Party and some other left and nationalist organizations. What's interesting here is that many people say this party was actually created by Putin in order to weaken the Communist Party. And it did in the 2003 elections, for example. So they take votes away from the Communist Party, just like people say when Ross Perot or Nader goes out, they're taking votes from the Democrats or Republicans, whichever one it seems like they're drawing votes from. When we get to the center, so this is the left and this is the right, and here in the center, you've got a few parties. Yabloko literally means apple, which is the liberal or liberal social democratic party. And has been the chief one from the post-1991 period, but it's been incredibly weak. It's pro-Western, it favors ties to NATO and the European Union. It's basically a white-collar urban party. In 2011, they had no seats. They only got 3.4% of the popular vote. Um, Another one with no seats is Right Cause, which includes a coalition of small parties and groups that came together under Yeltsin, um, under various cabinet ministers under Yeltsin. The problem is that this group actually detracts from this group, Yabloko, leaving both out in the cold. And so in 2011, they got 0 seats, 0.5% of the popular vote. And then down below, you've got the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, the LDPR. And this should actually be, well, this is the furthest right. So we've got a center left, center right, and then a very far right party right here. Again, the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia. The key, if it says democratic, that says it all right there. Not so democratic. So Zhirinovsky. That's, of course, not always the rule. In democratic states, it's not. Vladimir Zhirinovsky is the head of this party. He's this guy who wants Alaska back. He's waiting to see the U.S. fragment between the North and the South. In 1993, he scored a big win, but since then, his party has gradually declined. Through 2003 and 2007, it actually did a little bit better because they took a stand against Putin. I'm sorry, because they took a stand with Putin. In other words, they aligned themselves with Putin, or kowtowed to Putin, depending on how you look at it. And so in 2011, they got about 12.5% of the seats. Back in 1993, I think they had gotten around 23%, somewhere in that area. So they've been on the decline, but they've rebounded a bit. And finally, the key party here is United Russia. It was actually a couple parties that came together in 2001 to create this. And this party is all about power. It's not about ideology. They support whoever's on top, aka Putin, since 1999. This is Putin's party. It's his creation. So in 2011, they got 53% of the seats. They've got a majority in parliament, which is crucial. So there you have this sort of party outlook. Now, with respect to civil society, it's not a big surprise that it's quite weak. Why would it be weak? Well, communism decimated whatever civil society there was. You didn't need a civil society. Civil society was something that was frowned upon. Before that, it was weak because you had an agrarian state. Then you had communism. There was a huge growth since Glasnost. But then the government began to crack down, especially under Putin. They put people in jail. They broke up demonstrations. Created a lot of administrative hurdles to register in some civil society organizations. For example, you have to register. They made it hard to collect donor money. You're seen as a foreign agent. You have to register as a foreign agent if you get donor money. If you don't get donor money, well, there's not a lot of money out there in Russia for you. There's not a strong tendency towards philanthropy. What's interesting is we've seen a lot of activism over the last couple of years, especially since the 2011 parliamentary elections, which were broadly seen as fraudulent. At that point, about 20,000 people came out in Moscow to protest. Maybe they came out, I'm sorry, let me correct that. I think it was the 2012 presidential elections that 20,000 people came out to protest. But there were, I don't know how many people came out in the 2011 elections, but there were a lot. When they came out after the presidential elections, you had a really strong police presence. They knew these guys were coming because of the parliamentary elections before. You had a lot of injuries and hundreds of people were arrested. Some types of civil society activism are less regulated, though. Religious groups have grown in strength in part as people after communism became free to choose their religion. But then in later years, out of nationalism, the government restricted non-Orthodox churches as sort of a threat to stability. The last point right here is resource dependency. And I really want to make sure you understand this because this is a very common phenomenon. So today in Russia, there are about 300,000 plus organizations that are registered. Although many of them are registered, they exist in name only. They lack money to support themselves, so they really live from grant to grant, and then they get dormant for a bunch of years. And then they're just an organization, quote unquote, of 2 or 3 members. Not really an organization at all. Resource dependency. Uh, let's start with the basics. So an organization can start for a good cause, but it needs money to exist, right? We all do things. We work. We go to school. We don't have time to just run these organizations, and so what they do is they rely on external grants because usually there aren't a lot of people in these newly democratizing or non-democratic states. There's not a lot of philanthropy going on, and so you have to go externally for your money. So they'll go up to the USAID and apply for a grant. Problem is that some projects are more likely to get grants than others. And so organizations begin to tailor their projects to those that are the most fundable. What this means is that they're tailoring output to what foreign donors like. And they're changing from an issue that was of critical local import to issues that are of interest really to Westerners. So, for example, think about a local environmental group that wants to get rid of an incinerator. Typical backyard issue. Organizers are on a roll. They're collecting signatures and maybe they're galvanizing the public a bit, but people don't have a lot of money for this. And so organizers look for grants, and they find there's a bunch of money out there for cutting back. I don't know, cutting back on consumption, like eliminating plastic bags, for example. But there's not much related to their hometown dilemma, which is this incinerator. So the organization leaders get this grant for cutting back on plastic bag use. But this might be something that has very little meaning in their local community. Um, and so people aren't so interested in this, but this is the project they've got. And so they produce internet sites. Well, they have an internet site and they update their internet site. They produce flyers about how, I don't know, these bags decompose very slowly and people should invest in reusable bags. But few people actually see the websites, and the reusable bags are more expensive, so people ignore them. In other words, what you've done by introducing foreign grants is you've changed two things. You've changed the direction of the organization. It used to be about incinerators, and now it's about something that's more foreign to the local population, something they're not interested in. And you've also changed the way that they actually do their work. They used to go door to door, and now they're producing an internet site and flyers, and probably glossy brochures that local people are never going to see. Okay. Now imagine that the next hot grant topic is global warming, which is also very important, but it's far from the local issues where people are struggling with the really day-to-day issues. And so again, they become alienated. So this is the notion of resource dependency, where you have these organizations, they depend on outside grants to get to be supported. And then they have to adapt their tactics, strategies, and even overarching mission in order to accommodate this. And then they become foreign to their local population. The last thing I want to touch on is the political economy. You can't understand Russia today without this. You had an initial shock therapy program in 1992. Again, shock therapy, if you remember from our discussion about communism, was this initial stopping subsidies, rapid movement towards a free market. Okay, so the result was enormous inflation, an increase in poverty. People were selling everything. By the time I got there in 1994, people were lining the streets, especially older people, and they were selling pots, pans, sweaters, old clothes, anything they could. This was also a period of insider privatization. Remember, not only are you introducing the market economy, so supply and demand, but you're also privatizing the entire state. The state was entirely public, more or less. And so now you're suddenly privatizing it, privatizing all the massive industry that Stalin helped build. And what happened is this really demonstrated that the capitalist system that Russia had just adopted was certainly not a purely democratic one. You have this nouveau riche, this new rich, which comes to power, these oligarchs who control certain spheres. You have the rise in crime and corruption. People can, if you know the right people, you can buy a factory for pennies and then sell it off, and earn a nice big profit as you sell off the chairs and the I don't know, the whatever else you have in a factory. And so ultimately, you're talking about lots of people who become unemployed, which leads to lots of have-nots, and then this new rich, which just forms. This is also a move toward Russia's independence. Also marks a move towards mercantilism. The state never really left the economy, but it's increasingly under Putin been come back, and the Putin's used these strong arm tactics to bring key state industries, especially oil and gas, away from these nouveau riches and especially these oligarchs, and into state hands. So by these oligarchs, I mean really a handful of people who under Yeltsin were able to amass enormous wealth and strategic stakes within key state one-time state resources. So we're talking about things like heavy metals, mining, things like that, and they became filthy rich. And again, power is fungible. They actually translated this power into this economic power into political power. Putin was very weary of that when he came to power, and he cracked down on a lot of them, forcing some into exile. Berezovsky, if you've heard of him, he was one oligarch who went into exile in the UK and died very recently. Very recently, if you're listening to this in 2013, means in mid 2013. So anyway, some have been arrested and are often in various jails in Russia, and some are in exile. What this mercantilist program that Putin's pursued does is it creates political strength for the incumbent. You get broad political support because you've got lots of cash coming into the economy. Think about it. If you take back the oil sphere, the oil sector, and that brings lots of money into the economy, well, you've got the reappearance of this strong, or the appearance in this case in Russia, of this strong, successful state. It's also great for satisfying your stakeholders. You've got a pro-government business elite. You've got more people you can dispense privileges to. And so we have seen a major growth in the public sector as an employer over the past several years. And the oil and gas money has really been used to modernize this crumbling infrastructure within Russia, but also as a foreign policy tool, which we talked about when we talked about globalization, pipeline politics. I think that's it with respect to Russia, and we'll stop you there.